question 4 of our evaluation, it was who's our audience and why. I think the audience for our beginning of our film would be challenging compared to that of what we saw from the war documentary films that we analysed, as from what we analysed we realised that the audience for war films were predominantly male, as well as being of a more higher class and being older, as in between 30 and 60, and there wasn't really much of a female audience for these kinds of films, and for documentaries the audience was an even mix of male and female, but it was usually more adults. We wanted our audience to challenge this by having a larger range for our target audience. So I think the audience for our film, we'd have the older generation, maybe of the B, C1 and C2 class in demographics. I think this because it's centred around the war, and from 1940s point of view, they'd be able to relate to it a bit more, because even they may have been affected by it, by being in the war for the older generation, but also by being affected by it somewhere or another, by either their parents or their aunts and uncles, or even their siblings, older siblings. So I think they'd be part of the audience because they'd be able to relate to the actual historic events that happened, and being interested in it because they know that their family had been affected by it, or they were around in the time that it was taking place. So the historic aspect to it would be part of why the older generation would be part of the audience, but also probably of a middle higher class part of the audience, because as soldiers who are fighting in the war for our country, they would be part of that audience. They'd be part of that social class, as they'd be more C1, C2 class, so we'd want to appeal to them, so I think they'd be interested in it and be part of the audience. But also I think that part of the target audience would be of the younger generation, maybe the E class of the social demographics, because we incorporated the younger aspect into the film by having the 4 main protagonists being teenagers who were 17. The Jewish teenagers were younger, and I think that would make younger people be part of the target audience, because although they may not be entirely interested in the historical events that happened, although they might be interested in the war because part of their family had been affected by it, they'd be able to relate to the younger protagonists a lot more, and they'd be able to relate to the fact that the plot of the story is the Jewish teenagers running away from the Nazi soldiers and trying to escape and find somewhere that they can hide and somewhere that they can feel safe, and I think a lot of teenagers would be able to relate to that a lot. And also, although adults could, I think in the social times that we're in, I think that teenagers would be able to relate to that plot a lot more, even if it's not for the Second World War aspect of it. Just by their lives they'd be able to relate to that and maybe escape into that, and to be interested in the hope of being able to escape and find somewhere that they feel safe and to hide. And I think that's why the younger generation would be able to be part of our audience. So I think our audience ranges from teenagers to the older generation, simply because we've diversified it a lot by adding certain parts for the film, by having a really modern and interesting plot, but basing it in an older time, which would appeal to everybody in one way or another.